Hello, I'm Dr. Rocky Mirza, and the purpose of this, my first YouTube video, is to introduce you to two books I have written, both of which are related to American imperialism. The first of these books is called The Rise and Fall of the American Empire. That's what it looks like. And the sequel is called American Invasions. The first book was written in 2007, but I started the process in 2004, and the inspiration was the re-election of President George W. Bush. By 2004, it was very clear to me that the American voters knew that President Bush had lied to them about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Nevertheless, they re-elected him for a second term, and this reinforces my view that the primary motivation of the American people is what I would call warmongering. Now, we've heard about the so-called military-industrial complex that is very interested in wars, but what has never been mentioned is the fact that the entire American economy is built around wars. There are bases, military bases, scattered throughout the United States, and American families depend typically on their husbands being employed by the military to support the family. That is why across America, most Americans support wars. In addition, a black young person has little chance of ever going to university without joining the American military. So when you combine the fact that so many American families depend on wars, and businesses depend on selling munitions related to wars, and politicians are first and foremost American presidents who are called commander-in-chief, who must wage wars to justify their position, and military generals who must also wage wars to justify their position. This is really what explains American warmongering across the globe. Now, my first book, which is called Rise and Fall of the American Empire, obviously began with the beginning of the United States, first as a colony of England, then an independent United States, consistent of a thin strip of land on the Atlantic seacoast. The Americans came here from the beginning to fight First Nations for their lands, and once they became independent, they expanded those invasions right across the American continent, taking away all of the First Nations lands. They then expanded into lands previously conquered by Spain and Mexico, taking half of what was then Mexico. Not content with that, they moved across the Pacific, conquering small islands in the Pacific, beginning with Hawaii, and then went to other parts of Asia, and of course, all of Latin America, and today in the Middle East. When I wrote that first book, as I said, it was inspired by the American invasion of Iraq. Now, it's called Rise and Fall because at the same time, there is, as some of you know, something called globalization, which I really call the global shift because it's quite different from the old-fashioned globalization. Why global shift? I'm referring to the fact that the West has moved many of its factories to what are called emerging economies in China, Brazil, and other parts of Asia. That global shift will reduce the relative size of economies in the West, including the United States. And this is, in my view, the primary reason why the American economy will begin to decline, as I predicted in my first book, which was published in 2007. Now, when I was writing that book, I was amazed by how many countries the United States invaded, hence the title for my sequel, American Invasions. Of course, the United States began by invading countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. In some cases, they invaded the same country as many as 5 times. Today, of course, most of those invasions are in the Middle East. While President Bush was the inspiration for both books, President Obama continues that same warmongering today in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, in Yemen, in Syria, in Libya, in almost every corner of what has been called the Middle East. Contrary to the kind of propaganda we hear, where most of us believe the United States to be a country for freedom and peace, the facts show otherwise. The Americans generate wars across the globe because they're addicted to it. There can be no other explanation. Of course, when the West first came to the New World and went to Asia, they said they went for trade. But trade is a voluntary exchange by 2 parties which does not require force. Anytime force is used, it's colonization, it's not trade. And therefore the West colonized to steal the lands and resources of countries outside Europe. That is what the United States has continued. That is their purpose. Colonization, feeding the military-industrial complex, and of course using massive propaganda to suggest that they're interested in things like freedom and democracy. In reality, the United States was born when slave owners like Washington wanted to take away the colony from the aristocracy in Britain to form their own slave-owning aristocracy. These were people who had large plantations from land stolen from the First Nations, and where they used slaves from Africa to work those plantations. How can anyone believe that these people believed in freedom when in fact they were slave owners? That kind of propaganda, which began with George Washington, continues to this day by people like President Obama. A simple example of that is how the United States today is saying that the reasons they've invaded countries like Libya and Syria is because people like President Bashar al-Assad is killing his own people. Well, what did President Lincoln do when the Americans had their own civil war? Lincoln clearly killed his own people in the United States. Why is he so revered as an important president when the president of Syria is being vilified? Furthermore, the United States was a voluntary union between North and South. The southern states had the total right to secede if they wished. Whereas in the case of Syria and Libya, it's the West that went there to begin a civil war. And that is why it's very important that the rulers of those countries defend the right to have their own country. American meddling is what is stirring up those so-called civil wars across the Middle East. I hope that you will be objective and not be carried away by this Western propaganda, and that you will look at my website, RockyAmericanInvasions.com. That is www.RockyAmericanInvasions.com. You can also Google my name, Rocky, middle initial M, Mirza, or Trafford Publishing, or American Invasions, or Rise and Fall of the American Empire. Thank you for listening to this video and hope to see you again.